When did a stranger's words stick with you for years? I was 17, working the graveyard shift at a 24-hour diner in the worst part of town. Mom had kicked me out 3 months earlier for refusing to lie to her boyfriend about where she hid her pills. Living in my beat-up Honda with $340 to my name, this job was all that stood between me and complete homelessness. The diner attracted the usual crowd: truck drivers, drunk sobering up, and people with nowhere else to go. I'd learned to keep my head down, pour coffee, and avoid eye contact. Most customers were harmless, just lonely, but some made my skin crawl with their lingering stares and inappropriate comments. It was 3:47 a.m. on a Tuesday when she walked in. An elderly woman, maybe 70, wearing a stained yellow coat and shoes held together with duct tape. Her gray hair hung in greasy strands, and she clutched a torn plastic bag like it contained treasures. Everything about her screamed homeless, mentally ill, someone to avoid. The other customers deliberately looked away when she passed their tables. She shuffled to the corner booth and sat down heavily, her joints creaking audibly. I grabbed the coffee pot, hoping she had enough money for a cup. As I approached, the smell hit me: unwashed body, old cigarettes, and something sour I couldn't identify. Coffee? I asked, keeping my distance. She looked up with startling blue eyes that seemed too clear for someone in her condition. "You're living in your car," she said matter-of-factly. I froze. "I'm sorry?" Red Honda, dented passenger door, parked behind the dumpster. Her voice was calm, certain. "Been watching you for 3 nights. You wash your face in the employee bathroom every morning before your shift ends." My blood ran cold. Was she stalking me? Planning something? I glanced around the empty diner, suddenly aware of how alone we were. The cook had stepped out for a smoke break. "Look, lady, I don't know what—" "Sit down," she interrupted. Something in her tone made me obey. I slid into the booth across from her, every muscle tense, ready to run. She studied my face with those unsettling eyes. "You think this is rock bottom," she said. "You think you've lost everything." I wanted to leave, but couldn't move. "You haven't," she continued. "But you will, soon. And when you do, you'll have a choice to make." "What are you talking about?" She reached into her plastic bag and pulled out a crumpled napkin. Written on it in shaky handwriting was my full name, my mom's address, and the date. But 3 weeks in the future. My hands started shaking. "How do you know my—" "In 18 days, you're going to get a phone call," she said, ignoring my question. "Someone's going to offer you something that seems like salvation. Easy money. A way out of sleeping in parking lots." She leaned forward, her eyes boring into mine. "Whatever you do, don't take it." I stared at the napkin. The date meant nothing to me, but seeing my name in her handwriting made my stomach twist into knots. "Why are you telling me this?" For the first time, she smiled. It wasn't comforting. "Because 23 years ago, someone gave me the same warning, and I didn't listen." She stood up, leaving a $20 bill on the table. "The coffee's on me," she said. "Use the rest for food. You're going to need your strength for what's coming." As she shuffled toward the door, I called out, "Wait! What happens if I don't listen?" She paused, her hand on the door handle. "You become me," she said without turning around. "And in 23 years, you'll be sitting in a diner at 4 a.m., trying to save some other stupid kid who won't listen either." The door chimed as she left. I sat there staring at the napkin until my shift ended, then drove to my usual parking spot behind the building. For the next 2 weeks, I kept the napkin in my wallet, checking it obsessively, counting down the days. 18 days later, my phone rang at exactly 11:17 p.m. "Is this Reese?" The voice was smooth, professional. My throat went dry. I looked at the napkin beside me on the car seat. Today's date matched exactly. "Yeah," I managed. "My name is Vincent Carver. I represent a company that helps young people in difficult situations. I understand you might be interested in earning some quick money." Every word the old woman had said came flooding back. "Easy money, a way out. Don't take it." "I don't know what you're talking about," I lied. Vincent chuckled. "Come now, Reese. You're sleeping in your car behind Murphy's Diner. You've got $47 in your checking account and a mother who won't return your calls. We can help." The specificity terrified me. How did he know these things? Had he been watching me too? "What kind of help?" "A simple delivery job. Drive from point A to point B. No questions asked. $5,000. $5,000. More money than I'd ever seen. Enough for an apartment, food, a chance to get back on my feet. Enough to prove to Mom that I wasn't the failure she thought I was. What am I delivering? Does it matter? $5,000, Reese. Cash. Tonight." I thought about the woman's warning. About her saying I'd become her if I didn't listen. But $5,000 could change everything. I could get an apartment, maybe go back to school, build a real life. The silence stretched between us. "I understand your hesitation," Vincent continued. "Tell you what. Meet me for coffee first. No commitment. Just a conversation between 2 adults discussing a business opportunity." That sounded reasonable. Just a conversation. I wasn't agreeing to anything. "Where do I meet you?" "There's an abandoned warehouse on Bleecker Street. Warehouse 47. Be there in 30 minutes. He hung up before I could change my mind. I sat in my car, engine running, staring at the napkin. The woman had known this would happen. Somehow, impossibly, she'd known. But meeting him didn't mean I had to take the job. I could just listen to his offer and walk away. I drove to Bleecker Street. The area was industrial, deserted at this time of night. Warehouse 47 sat at the end of a row of identical buildings, all dark except for one dim light in a window. I parked and walked to the side door, which opened before I could knock. Vincent Carver was exactly what I'd expected. Expensive suit, perfectly groomed. The kind of confidence that came with money. Behind him stood 2 men built like refrigerators, their eyes scanning the street behind me. "Reese," Vincent smiled. "Right on time. Come in." The warehouse was mostly empty except for a few crates and folding chairs. In the center sat a metal briefcase gleaming under the fluorescent lights. "The job is simple," Vincent said, gesturing for me to sit. "Drive this briefcase to an address in Chicago, deliver it to a man named Kozlov, drive back, don't open it, don't ask questions, don't stop except for gas. That's it? That's it. 12 hours round trip for $5,000. He opened another briefcase, revealing neat stacks of $100 bills. The money was real, more real than anything in my life had been for months. Half now, half when you return. I stared at the money. It was salvation wrapped in green paper. "What's in the briefcase?" Vincent's smile didn't waver. "Something that doesn't concern you." One of the refrigerators stepped forward. The message was clear. Don't ask questions you don't want answered. But something the woman had said nagged at me. 23 years ago, someone gave me the same warning, and I didn't listen. What had she delivered? What had destroyed her life so completely that she ended up homeless, warning strangers in diners? "I need to think about it," I said. Vincent's expression hardened slightly. "This is a time-sensitive opportunity, Reese. I have other candidates if you're not interested." The threat was subtle, but clear. Take it or lose it. I looked at the money again. $5,000. A chance to escape the cycle of poverty and desperation that had defined my life. "Okay," I said. "I'll do it." Vincent handed me the first briefcase and a slip of paper with an address. "The drop is at midnight. Don't be late. And Reese?" He placed a hand on my shoulder. "Discretion is important in this business. If anyone asks what you're doing, you're visiting your sick grandmother." I loaded the briefcase into my Honda's trunk and started driving north. For the first hour, I felt victorious. I'd solved all my problems in one night. I'd have enough money for an apartment, maybe even go back to school. Mom would have to respect me when I showed up with real money, proof that I could take care of myself. But as the miles passed, the woman's words kept echoing. "You become me." What had she meant? What had she delivered 23 years ago that ruined her life so completely? I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was documents. Maybe it was money for someone else. Maybe it was completely legal and Vincent just preferred discretion for business reasons, but doubt gnawed at me as I drove through the darkness. I pulled off at a truck stop near the Illinois border. The briefcase seemed to pulse in my trunk as I bought coffee and used the bathroom. When I returned, a state trooper was walking around my car, running his hands along the edges, checking the license plate. "This your vehicle, son?" My heart hammered against my ribs. "Yes, sir." "Mind if I ask what you're doing out here so late?" "Driving to Chicago to see my sister." I lied. The cover story Vincent had suggested automatically spilling out. He studied my face, then walked to the back of the car. "Pop the trunk for me." Every muscle in my body tensed. If he found the briefcase, if whatever was inside was illegal, my life was over. "Actually, I don't have to do that without a warrant, do I?" I said, trying to keep my voice steady. The trooper's expression hardened. "Suspicious behavior, son. Young kid, driving alone at night. Nervous as hell. You can open it voluntarily, or I can call for backup and we'll wait for a judge." I thought about the money sitting in my passenger seat, about Vincent's men, about having to go back to sleeping in my car behind a diner, counting tips to afford ramen noodles. "Fine," I said, popping the trunk. The briefcase sat there, innocent-looking. The trooper picked it up, tested its weight, then set it down and examined the locks. "What's in here?" "I don't know. I'm just delivering it for a friend." "You don't know what you're transporting?" Too late, I realized how that sounded, how completely stupid and suspicious it was. The trooper set the briefcase on the ground and pulled out a tool I didn't recognize. Within seconds, the locks clicked open. Inside were neat rows of white powder in plastic bags, each one marked with symbols I didn't understand. "Jesus Christ," I whispered. "Reese Miller," the trooper said, reading my license. "You're under arrest for possession with intent to distribute." The world tilted. Vincent had set me up. The simple delivery job was running drugs across state lines. And I'd been caught red-handed, exactly like the woman had warned me would happen. As the handcuffs clicked shut, I understood exactly what the woman had meant. I was becoming her, one catastrophic decision at a time. In the holding cell, I called the only lawyer I could afford, a public defender named Rodriguez who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. His office was a windowless room that smelled like burnt coffee and broken dreams. "First offense?" he asked, flipping through my file without really looking at me. "Yeah. You're looking at 5 to 10 years minimum. Federal drug trafficking charges don't mess around." But I didn't know what was in the briefcase. Someone paid me to deliver it. I was set up. Rodriguez laughed bitterly. "Kid, do you have any idea how many times I've heard that story? Every drug mule in America was just delivering something for a friend. It's true. Prove it. Got any evidence this Vincent character exists? Phone records? Text messages? Witnesses?" I thought about it. Vincent had called from an unknown number. Our only meeting was in an abandoned warehouse with no surveillance. Even if the police found the warehouse, there'd be no evidence we'd ever been there. "No," I admitted. "Then you're screwed. The prosecution has video of you loading the briefcase into your car, fingerprints on the handle, and 5 pounds of heroin in your possession. Open and shut case. 5 pounds? Enough to put you away for a very long time. Unless," he leaned back in his chair, "you cooperate. Give them names. Help them build cases against your suppliers." "I don't have suppliers. Vincent was the only person I met." "Then you serve the full sentence. 5 to 10 years minimum, probably closer to 10 given the quantity." That night, lying on a thin mattress in county lockup, I thought about the woman. She'd tried to warn me. She'd known exactly what would happen, and I'd ignored her, seduced by the promise of easy money. But something else bothered me. How had she known? How had she predicted Vincent's call down to the exact time and date? 3 days later, Rodriguez brought bad news and a possible lifeline. "The prosecution is offering a deal. Plead guilty to reduced charges, serve 18 months, testify against your contacts. I told you, I don't have any contacts. Vincent was the only person I met. Then you serve the full sentence. 5 to 10 years, 18 months versus a decade. The math was simple, even if it felt like betraying myself. I took the deal. Federal prison was an education in all the ways life could go wrong. I met guys who'd made the same choice I had. Desperate kids recruited to transport drugs with promises of easy money. Most had been caught on their first run, just like me. We were disposable. Vincent probably recruited a new desperate kid every week. My cellmate was a 22-year-old named Curtis who'd been running drugs since he was 15. The thing about guys like Vincent, he told me during one of our late-night conversations, is they never use the same kid twice. Too much risk. They find kids with no options, promise them the world, then throw them away when they get caught. How do they find them? They scout. Look for kids working night shifts, living rough, no family support. They watch them for weeks, learn their routines, figure out their breaking point. Vincent knew things about me, personal things. Curtis nodded. They do their homework, background checks, social media. Sometimes they even talk to people who know you. They build a profile. Then they craft their pitch to hit your specific vulnerabilities. So I was marked from the beginning, probably. Question is, who marked you? I thought about it. Someone had to have pointed Vincent toward me. Someone who knew I was desperate, vulnerable, perfect recruitment material. It wasn't until my 3rd month inside that I figured it out. During visiting hours, I watched other inmates meet with family members, parents, siblings, girlfriends, people who still cared enough to make the trip. I'd had exactly 0 visitors. Mom hadn't even returned my calls. But one day, I saw a familiar face in the visiting room, not visiting me, visiting another inmate. A man in an expensive suit, perfectly groomed, with the kind of confidence that came with money. Vincent Carver. Except the nameplate on his visitor's badge read, David Walsh, attorney. He was visiting Curtis. That night, I confronted my cellmate. You know Vincent. Curtis didn't deny it. His real name is David Walsh. He's a lawyer who works both sides of the street. You set me up. Not exactly. But I told him about a kid who might be interested in making some money. I didn't know he'd have you arrested. Why would you do that? Curtis looked ashamed. He promised to get my sentence reduced if I fed him potential recruits. I thought you'd make the delivery and everything would be fine. Instead, I got 18 months and you got what? Time served. I'm getting out next week. The betrayal cut deeper than the arrest. I'd trusted Curtis, shared my story with him, considered him a friend, and he'd been working for Vincent the entire time. But it also answered a question that had been nagging at me. How had the woman in the diner known about Vincent's call? How had she predicted it so precisely? Because she'd been through this before. Not just the arrest and conviction, the entire cycle. Someone had recruited her, used her, thrown her away. And somehow she'd learned to spot the signs when it was happening to others. The rest of my sentence passed in a blur of anger and planning. I wasn't just going to serve my time and disappear. I was going to understand how Vincent's operation worked, how they recruited kids, how they protected themselves, how they stayed in business year after year. I started documenting everything Curtis told me before his release. Names, locations, methods of operation. I talked to other inmates who'd been recruited by Vincent or people like him. I built a comprehensive picture of how the system worked. When I got out 18 months later, I had a felony record and no prospects. The diner wouldn't hire me back. Most places wouldn't even let me fill out an application. I bounced between halfway houses and shelters, taking day labor jobs when I could find them. But I also had something else. Knowledge. I knew how Vincent operated. I knew the signs of recruitment. I knew how to spot kids who were about to make the same mistake I'd made. 5 years later, I was back to sleeping in my car, but this time by choice. I'd found work as a night security guard at a warehouse, which gave me access to the areas where desperate kids congregated. The pay was minimal, but it covered my basic needs and gave me the freedom to pursue my real mission. 7 years later, I was panhandling outside grocery stores, but the money I collected wasn't for me. It went to a savings account I'd opened under a false name. Money I used to help kids who listened to my warnings get back on their feet. 10 years later, I looked exactly like the woman who'd tried to warn me. And I understood why she'd been sitting in that diner at 3:47 a.m., watching a 17-year-old kid with desperate eyes. I spent my days wandering the city, collecting bottles for recycling money, and identifying potential recruitment targets. At night, I'd sit in 24-hour diners, nursing a single cup of coffee for hours, while watching kids who looked like I once had. The staff tolerated me because I tipped well and didn't cause trouble. They didn't know I was conducting surveillance. That's when I started noticing them. Young people, 17 or 18, working night shifts with desperation in their eyes. Kids who slept in their cars or crashed on friends' couches. Kids who looked like they'd take any opportunity to change their situation. Kids like I'd been. The first time I tried to warn someone, a 19-year-old named Crystal working at a truck stop, she called security on me. Can't say I blamed her. I looked like a crazy homeless woman talking about mysterious phone calls and drug dealers. But I kept trying. The second attempt was a boy named Dominic who worked at an all-night convenience store. When I told him about the phone call that would come, he laughed and said I'd been watching too many movies. 3 weeks later, I saw his mugshot in the local paper. Arrested for drug trafficking. The third was a girl named Valencia who cleaned office buildings at night. She listened politely to my warning, then told her supervisor I was harassing customers. A month later, she was dead. Overdose, according to the obituary. But I knew better. She'd gotten involved with Vincent's people and ended up as collateral damage. Over the next few years, I learned to spot them more effectively. The tells were always the same. The exhaustion, the anxiety, the way they counted their tips obsessively. I'd sit in their restaurants or stores, observing, waiting for the right moment. I also learned to be more strategic about my warnings. Instead of approaching kids directly, I'd leave notes where they'd find them. Sometimes I'd ask other customers to pass along messages. Occasionally, I'd call in anonymous tips to police if I thought a recruitment was imminent. Most of the time, I was too late. I'd show up to find them already gone, arrested, or worse. Vincent's operation had expanded over the years. He wasn't just recruiting drug mules anymore. He was running a full-scale trafficking operation that included prostitution, money laundering, and worse. But occasionally, I'd catch them in time. Some listened. Most didn't. There was Dante, who was about to start running guns for a gang until I convinced him to take a job at his uncle's garage instead. He's a mechanic now, married with 2 kids. There was Amy, who almost took a modeling job that was really prostitution. She became a nurse and sends me Christmas cards. There was Tyler, who was going to rob a convenience store to pay his rent. I talked him into calling his estranged grandfather instead. They reconciled, and Tyler finished college. For every success, there were 10 failures. But those small victories kept me going. The work consumed me completely. I had no life outside of tracking Vincent's operation and trying to save his potential victims. I lived in shelters and abandoned buildings, ate from food banks and dumpsters, wore clothes donated by churches. But I also built a network. Other people who'd been caught in Vincent's web and somehow escaped, former addicts who recognized the signs of recruitment, social workers who dealt with at-risk youth, even a few cops who were willing to bend the rules to help kids in trouble. We communicated through coded messages left in public places, libraries, laundromats, bus stations, anywhere kids like us might spend time. We shared information about Vincent's movements, his recruitment patterns, potential targets. It was guerrilla warfare against a system that fed on desperation. By my 15th year out of prison, I'd personally warned over 300 kids. Maybe 50 listened. Of those, perhaps half actually changed course because of my warning. 25 lives saved. It wasn't much, statistically speaking, but for those 25 kids, it was everything. The work aged me rapidly. Stress, poor nutrition, and constant exposure to the elements took their toll. By the time I was 45, I looked 60. By 50, I looked 70. People on the street assumed I was mentally ill. They weren't entirely wrong. Living on the margin, seeing the same cycles of exploitation play out year after year, watching kids destroy their lives despite my warning, it had broken something in me. But it had also forged something stronger, a sense of purpose that went beyond my own survival. 23 years after my arrest, I found myself in Murphy's Diner at 3:47 a.m., watching a 17-year-old kid pour coffee with the same desperate look I'd once worn. His name tag said Reese. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd been watching him for 3 nights, learning his routine. He lived in his car, just like I had. His mom had kicked him out, just like mine had. He was one phone call away from making the same mistake I'd made. Vincent Carver, if that was even his real name anymore, was still operating. I'd been tracking his pattern for years. He recruited kids from a specific demographic, 17 to 19 years old, homeless or near homeless, no family support, working dead-end jobs. He'd have someone scope them out for weeks before making contact. Reese fit the profile perfectly. I watched him approach my table, coffee pot in hand, trying to hide his nervousness around customers who looked like me. Kid probably thought I was dangerous. If only he knew I was trying to save his life. Coffee? He asked, keeping his distance. I looked up at him with eyes that had seen too much. You're living in your car, I said. The conversation played out exactly as I remembered my own encounter 23 years earlier. The shock, the denial, the moment when he realized I knew things I shouldn't know. I showed him the napkin with his information, told him about the phone call that would come in 18 days. When I left, I hoped this time would be different. For the next 18 days, I staked out the diner parking lot, watching Reese's routine. He kept checking his wallet obsessively, probably looking at the napkin. Good. At least he was thinking about it. I also did something I'd never done before. I prepared backup plans. If Reese ignored my warning, I would call in an anonymous tip to the police about Vincent's warehouse. If he took the bait and started driving toward Chicago, I would call in a tip about his car and license plate. I wasn't going to let another kid disappear into the system. On the 18th night, I positioned myself across the street with a clear view of his car. At 11:17 p.m., his phone lit up. I watched him answer, watched the conversation play out. Even from a distance, I could see his body language change. Temptation, desperation, the same internal battle I'd fought and lost 23 years ago. 20 minutes later, he drove away. My heart sank. Another failure. Another kid who wouldn't listen. But something was different this time. Instead of heading toward Bleecker Street, Reese drove to the police station. I followed at a distance, hardly daring to hope. Through the station windows, I watched him talking to a detective, gesturing animatedly. An hour later, he emerged with 2 officers who got into an unmarked car. They were going to bust Vincent. I drove to Warehouse 47 and parked where I could see the action. Sure enough, 20 minutes later, police cars surrounded the building. They arrested Vincent and his men, confiscated briefcases full of drugs and money. The sting operation made the morning news. Police had broken up a drug trafficking operation that had been recruiting minors for over 2 decades. Vincent, whose real name turned out to be Gregory Walsh, was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison. I found Reese at the diner 3 nights later. He was working his shift like nothing had happened, but I could see the difference in his posture. The desperation was gone, replaced by something that looked like hope. I ordered coffee and left him a $100 tip with a note. You listened. Now help others do the same. 6 months later, I read in the local paper that Reese had started a nonprofit organization helping homeless teenagers find legitimate work and housing. The article included a quote from him. Someone once told me that sometimes a stranger's warning can save your life. I want to be that stranger for other kids. I cut out the article and added it to my collection. Over the years, I'd accumulated dozens of similar clippings. Kids I'd warned who went on to become teachers, social workers, counselors, people who used their second chance to help others avoid the traps that had nearly destroyed them. It was a strange kind of legacy for someone who'd thrown away her own life, but maybe that was the point. Maybe some mistakes are so devastating that the only way to find redemption is to help others avoid making them. As Vincent's organization crumbled, other operations moved in to fill the void. The work was far from over, but now I had allies, people who understood the system because they'd been victims of it. Reese's nonprofit grew rapidly. Within 2 years, they were operating in 6 cities, helping hundreds of at-risk youth. But their real innovation was their early warning system, a network of former victims who could spot recruitment patterns and intervene before kids made irreversible mistakes. They called it the Guardian Project. I became their unofficial consultant, teaching volunteers how to recognize the signs of recruitment, how to approach potential victims, how to build trust with kids who had every reason to be suspicious of adults. But I also continued my own work. Late at night, when the official channels couldn't reach the kids who needed help most, I was still there, still watching, still warning. Occasionally, Reese and I would work together on particularly difficult cases, kids who were so damaged, so desperate, that they wouldn't trust anyone who looked like they had their life together. Those kids would listen to me. There was Catalina, a 16-year-old whose father had sold her to pay off gambling debts. She'd escaped, but was living on the streets, vulnerable to anyone who offered her shelter. When Vincent's replacement approached her, she was ready to say yes, but I got there first. I didn't just warn her about the dangers. I told her about the Guardian Project, about Reese's organization, about the safe houses and job training programs they offered. I gave her a path forward instead of just telling her what to avoid. She's in college now, studying social work. There was Marcus, a 17-year-old aging out of foster care with nowhere to go. He'd been recruited by a human trafficking ring that specialized in boys his age. They'd promised him a place to stay, food, protection from the gangs that controlled his neighborhood. I found him the night before he was supposed to report to them. Instead of giving him another lecture about the dangers of trusting strangers, I took him directly to one of Reese's safe houses. I introduced him to other boys who'd escaped similar situations. I let them tell their stories, show him their scars, explain what really happened to kids who trusted the wrong people. He never showed up for his appointment with the traffickers. He's a carpenter now, building houses for low-income families. The successes started to outnumber the failures, not because I'd gotten better at warning people, but because I'd gotten better at offering alternatives. It wasn't enough to tell kids not to trust criminals. You had to give them reasons to trust the legitimate helpers. I'm 68 now. My health is failing, and I know I don't have many years left, but I still make my rounds, visiting the late-night diners and truck stops, watching for kids who look like they're one bad decision away from destroying their futures. Last week, I sat across from a 16-year-old named Cassidy, who was about to take a job from a man who promised her easy money for a simple favor. I told her what would happen if she said yes. She listened. Yesterday, I saw her working at a legitimate restaurant, wearing a clean uniform and smiling at customers. Another small victory. But the real measure of success wasn't in the individual cases I'd handled. It was in the system Reese and his team had built. The Guardian Project now operated in 15 cities, with over 200 volunteers, most of them former victims who'd learned to spot and prevent recruitment. They'd helped over 3,000 at-risk youth over the past decade. More importantly, they'd created a sustainable model that could continue growing without me. People sometimes ask me if I regret the path my life took. It's a complicated question. Do I regret taking Vincent's deal? Absolutely. Do I regret the prison time? The years of homelessness? The constant struggle? Of course. But if I hadn't made those mistakes, I wouldn't be able to recognize kids heading toward the same cliff. I wouldn't have the credibility to warn them. My destruction became the foundation for their salvation. Some people save lives with medical degrees or heroic rescues. I save them with cautionary tales and crumpled napkins and 24-hour diners. It's not the life I planned, but it's the life I chose to make from the wreckage of my mistakes. 3 months ago, I was diagnosed with lung cancer. The doctors gave me 6 months, maybe less. I've spent most of that time getting my affairs in order, which doesn't take long when you don't have affairs to speak of. But there was one thing I needed to do. I tracked down Reese's nonprofit and requested a meeting. He's 31 now, married to a social worker named Diana, with a 2-year-old daughter named Hope. His organization has helped over 500 at-risk teenagers find legitimate work and housing. Not bad for a kid who almost threw his life away in the back of a Honda. We met at Murphy's Diner, where else, on a Tuesday afternoon. He looked good, confident, the kind of person who'd learned to turn pain into purpose. I wanted to thank you, he said as we sat in the same booth where I'd first warned him, and to tell you what's happened since that night. He told me about his work, about the kids they'd helped, about the halfway houses and job training programs his organization had created. Then he pulled out a folder. These are letters, he said, from people whose lives changed because you warned me and I was able to warn them. I flipped through dozens of handwritten notes. A former drug addict who became a counselor, a girl who'd almost joined a trafficking ring and became a teacher instead, a boy who'd been recruited by a gang and now runs a youth center. All because one desperate kid had listened to a crazy homeless woman's warning. There's something else, Reese said. He handed me an official-looking document. We're starting a new program, free housing for seniors who've dedicated their lives to helping others. The first apartment is yours if you want it. I stared at the lease agreement. A real apartment, a real address. After 23 years on the streets, there's one condition, he added with a smile. You have to keep doing what you do. Keep being that stranger who saves lives with warnings people don't want to hear. I moved into the apartment the following week. 1 bedroom, small kitchen, a view of the city where I'd spent so many years wandering. But the most important feature was its location, within walking distance of a dozen 24-hour establishments where desperate kids worked night shifts. My hunting grounds. The apartment came with something else I hadn't expected. Respect. People who worked at Reese's organization knew my story. They called me the Oracle, which made me laugh. If I was an oracle, I was one who dealt exclusively in avoiding disasters rather than predicting triumphs. But the title stuck. Soon, other social workers and counselors were calling me when they encountered kids who wouldn't listen to conventional advice. Apparently, there's something powerful about hearing warnings from someone who'd lived through the consequences. My methods weren't traditional. I didn't have training or credentials. I just had authenticity, the kind that only comes from having fallen all the way to the bottom and somehow found a way to make that fall meaningful. The Guardian Project formalized my role. I became their senior consultant, training new volunteers in what they called credible intervention techniques. Basically, how to use your own destruction to prevent someone else's. It was surreal, sitting in conference rooms with social workers and psychologists, teaching them skills I'd learned in shelters and holding cells. But it worked. Kids who wouldn't trust traditional authorities would listen to someone who'd been where they were. On good days, I'd sit in my apartment and read letters from kids who'd listened to my warnings. On bad days, when the cancer made breathing difficult, I'd remember faces of the ones who hadn't listened and wonder if I could have said something different. But mostly, I kept working. The apartment became a base of operations. I could track patterns more effectively, coordinate with other volunteers, maintain better records of potential recruitment targets. I also started writing. Documentation of Vincent's methods, profiles of other trafficking operations, detailed guides for spotting and preventing recruitment. The Guardian Project published these as training manuals for other organizations. My personal story became a case study in how individual trauma could be transformed into collective protection. Universities started inviting me to speak. Law enforcement agencies asked for consulting on trafficking cases. It was strange being treated as an expert on something I'd learned by being victimized. But if my expertise could prevent other kids from being exploited, I'd share it with anyone who would listen. Last month, I met a 17-year-old named Phoenix at an all-night laundromat. She was washing clothes in the sink because she didn't have quarters for the machines. Classic sign of someone vulnerable to recruitment. Someone's going to offer you a way out soon, I told her. When they do, remember that anything that sounds too good to be true usually is. She looked at me like I was insane. How could you possibly know that? Because I used to be you, I said. And someone tried to warn me. I didn't listen. 3 days later, Phoenix called the number I'd given her. A man had approached her with an offer to make easy money, doing simple work. Instead of saying yes, she reported him to police. The man turned out to be part of a new trafficking operation that had moved into the city after Vincent's organization was shut down. Phoenix's report led to a larger investigation that broke up the entire ring. Another small victory that became a big one. That afternoon, I got a call from my doctor. The cancer had spread faster than expected. Weeks, not months. I wasn't afraid of dying. I was afraid of not having enough time to save one more kid. But as I sat in my apartment that evening, looking at the wall of letters and newspaper clippings, I realized something. The work would continue without me. Reese and his organization were training other people to spot at-risk kids. Some of the people I'd helped were becoming helpers themselves. The stranger's words that had stuck with me for years, "You become me," had taken on a different meaning. Yes, I'd become the homeless woman who'd tried to warn me. But I'd also become something else. A teacher, a guardian, a voice in the darkness telling kids to step back from the cliff. And the kids I'd helped were becoming that voice for others. My phone rang at 2:30 a.m. It was Reese. "There's a situation," he said. 14-year-old runaway at the bus station. Someone's trying to recruit her. She won't talk to police or social workers. On my way, I said. I grabbed my coat and headed out into the night one last time. The girl's name was Rain, and she had the same hollow look I'd seen in mirrors for years. Dirty clothes, defensive posture, eyes that had seen too much too young. The man talking to her was smooth, professional, promising her food and shelter in exchange for small favors. I'd heard the pitch 1,000 times. "Rain," I called out. She looked up, startled. "Walk away from him, right now." "Who are you?" the man demanded. "Someone who knows exactly what you're offering and exactly what it costs." Rain stood frozen between us. The moment stretched like a held breath. "She's coming with me," the man said, reaching for Rain's arm. "No," Rain said quietly. "She's right. This feels wrong." The man's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing the predator underneath. Then he smiled and walked away, already scanning for his next target. Rain looked at me with tears in her eyes. "How did you know?" "Because someone tried to save me once." I didn't listen, but maybe you will. I called Reese, who arranged emergency placement for Rain in a safe house. As we waited for the social worker to arrive, I told her my story. Not the cleaned-up version I usually shared, but the real one. The drugs, the prison time, the years of homelessness, the slow climb back to something resembling a meaningful life. "That's going to be me?" she asked. "Only if you make the same choices I made. You can choose differently." The social worker arrived and took Rain to safety. As they drove away, she looked back at me through the rear window. I hope she remembers this moment when she's faced with her next crucial decision. By the time I got back to my apartment, the sun was rising. I made coffee and sat by the window, watching the city wake up. Somewhere out there were kids who would face impossible choices today. Some would make good decisions, others wouldn't. And somewhere, someone would be there to catch the ones who fell, or warn the ones who hadn't fallen yet. My phone buzzed with a text from Reese. Rain's doing well, wants to know if she can volunteer with the organization when she's older. Another full circle. I pulled out my laptop and started typing. If I only had weeks left, I wanted to document everything I'd learned about spotting and helping at-risk kids. Maybe it would help train the next generation of people doing this work. As I wrote, I thought about the woman who'd first warned me. I'd never learned her name, never found out what had happened to her after that night in the diner. But her words had shaped my entire life, even when I'd ignored them. You become me, she'd said. And I had. But I'd also become something she might not have expected. Someone who found a way to transform destruction into purpose, who turned personal failure into a tool for helping others succeed. The stranger's words that stuck with me for years weren't just a warning about what would happen if I made the wrong choice. They were a prophecy about what I could become if I learned from that choice. I became her, but I also became me. And maybe that's the real lesson. Not that we're doomed to repeat the mistakes of those who came before us, but that we can choose what those mistakes mean. We can let them define us, or we can let them refine us. I choose refinement. Even now, especially now, at the end of everything, I choose to believe that every warning issued, every kid who listens, every small victory matters. Because sometimes a stranger's words can stick with you for years. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, you get the chance to be that stranger for someone else. The work continues. But what I didn't expect was how the work would continue to evolve, even in my final week. 3 days after the incident with Rain, Reese called with news that changed everything. We found her, he said. The woman who warned you 23 years ago. My blood went cold. What do you mean? Her name was Eleanor Vasquez. She died 2 years ago, but she left behind journals, hundreds of them, documenting every kid she tried to help over 30 years. How did you find her? Rain remembered something you said about a woman in a yellow coat who'd warned you. She mentioned it to one of our volunteers, who remembered hearing a similar story. We started digging. An hour later, I was sitting in Reese's office, staring at a pile of composition notebooks. Eleanor's handwriting was cramped but legible, each entry dated and detailed. Entry from 23 years ago. Tried to warn a 17-year-old at Murphy's Diner tonight. Kid named Mallory. Sleeping in her car, working graveyard shift. Vincent's people have been watching her for 2 weeks. Left her a napkin with the date of his call. She looked skeptical, but took it. Hope she listens. They never do. She'd called me Mallory. I'd been using fake names for so long, I'd almost forgotten that was my real one. I flipped through more entries. Page after page of warnings issued, kids approach, successes and failures documented in heartbreaking detail. Timothy at the truck stop, 19 years old, parents dead, living in his car. Vincent called him last night. He took the job. Arrested 3 days later with 12 kilos of heroin. Another failure. Jessica at the all-night diner on 5th Street. 16, kicked out by foster family. Warned her about the modeling agent who'd been circling. She listened. Called police instead. Modeling agent arrested, turned out to be running underage prostitution ring. Small victory. But the entry that stopped me cold was dated exactly 1 week after our encounter. Mallory didn't take Vincent's deal. Watched from across the street. She drove to police station instead of warehouse. Police raided warehouse that night. Vincent arrested. First time in 30 years, one of my warnings actually led to stopping them instead of just saving one kid. Maybe this changes things. Eleanor had been there. She'd watched me drive to the police station. She'd seen Vincent get arrested. I kept reading. The entries after that date showed a change in her approach. Instead of just warning individual kids, she started documenting patterns, building cases, working with police and social workers. Started calling Detective Morrison with tips. He's willing to listen, maybe because his daughter was trafficked 5 years ago. Gave him Vincent's backup locations. 3 more arrests this week. Found another woman doing what I do. Her name is Patricia. Lost her son to traffickers. We're sharing information now. 2 sets of eyes better than one. Patricia introduced me to a social worker named Linda. Linda wants to set up a formal network, people who've been through this, helping to prevent it. Maybe my story can become something bigger. The final entries were from shortly before her death. Sick, cancer, not much time left, but the network is growing. 12 people now, operating in 4 cities. Maybe this thing I started will outlive me. Gave all my journals to Linda. She promises to find the kids I helped, tell them they're part of something bigger. Maybe together they can do what I couldn't do alone. Last entry. If anyone reads this, the work matters. Every warning matters. Every kid who listens matters. Don't stop. I closed the journal and looked at Reese. She started all this? She started the network that became the Guardian Project. Linda, the social worker she mentioned, she's our current board chair. I need to meet her. Linda Martinez was in her 70s, with gray hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. We met at a coffee shop near the Guardian Project headquarters. Eleanor talked about you constantly in her final years, Linda said. You were her success story, the one who proved her methods could work. I didn't just listen to her warning. I acted on it. That's what made the difference. Most kids, even if they listen, they still make smaller versions of the same mistake. They avoid the specific trap but fall into a different one. You broke the cycle completely. Because I went to the police. Because you understood the system. Eleanor had been warning kids for 30 years, but she'd never found one who grasped that the individual predators were just part of a larger operation. Linda pulled out a folder. Eleanor left something for you specifically. She hoped someone would find you eventually. Inside was a letter in Eleanor's shaky handwriting. Mallory, or whatever name you're using now. If you're reading this, it means the network found you. Good. That was always the plan. I've been watching kids fall into traps for 30 years. You were the first one who didn't just avoid the trap, you helped destroy it. That told me something important. The key isn't just saving individual kids, it's stopping the systems that prey on them. I hope by now you've learned what I learned too late. Your destruction can become the foundation for other people's salvation, not just one person at a time, but systematically. The network I started is yours now. All of ours, really. Everyone who's been where we've been and decided to use that experience to help others. The stranger's words that stick with you for years, they're not just warnings, they're instructions. Pass them on. Build something bigger. Make sure the work continues. Eleanor P.S. The real victory isn't saving kids from making the same mistakes we made. It's helping them build lives so good they can't imagine making those mistakes. I folded the letter carefully. How many people are in the network now? Over 500, operating in 37 cities. We've helped prevent more than 10,000 recruitments in the past 5 years. 10,000 kids who didn't get that phone call, who didn't take that deal, who didn't end up in prison or worse. All because Eleanor had refused to let her own destruction be meaningless. What do you need from me? I asked. Help us train the next generation. Not just how to spot recruitment, but how to build the kind of support systems that make kids immune to recruitment in the first place. For my remaining weeks, I threw myself into the work with renewed purpose. The Guardian Project wasn't just about intervention anymore. It was about prevention, building communities where desperate kids had legitimate options before the illegitimate ones found them. We developed programs that Eleanor had only dreamed of, job training that led to real careers, housing programs that gave kids stability, educational support that opened doors instead of closing them. But the core principle remained the same. People who'd been victimized were uniquely qualified to prevent others from being victimized. My final project was a comprehensive training manual for new volunteers, not just the warning signs to watch for, but the deeper skills. How to build trust with suspicious kids, how to offer hope without making false promises, how to connect personal pain to collective purpose. On my last good day, I sat in the same diner where Eleanor had first warned me, watching a new volunteer, a former trafficking victim named Carmen, approach a 19-year-old who'd been targeted for recruitment. Carmen sat down across from the girl and said, "Someone's going to offer you something that sounds too good to be true. When they do, call this number instead." The conversation played out exactly as mine had 23 years earlier. But this time, I wasn't the one giving the warning. I was the one who'd helped build the system that made the warning possible. The girl listened. 2 days later, she called Carmen instead of answering the phone when the recruiter reached out. Carmen connected her with job training, housing assistance, and a support network of people who understood exactly what she'd been through. Another life saved, another cycle broken. That night, I updated Eleanor's journal with my final entry. The work continues. Not just one stranger warning another, but hundreds of strangers building something bigger. Something that Eleanor started, and that will outlive all of us. The words that stick aren't just warnings anymore. They're invitations. Invitations to join something larger than our individual stories, to turn our pain into other people's protection. Every kid who doesn't get that phone call, every kid who doesn't take that deal, every kid who builds a life instead of destroying one, that's Eleanor's legacy. That's all our legacy. The stranger's words continue to echo, but now they're not just about avoiding disasters. They're about building something beautiful from the ruins of our mistakes. I died 3 days later, surrounded by people whose lives had been touched by Eleanor's work. Reese was there, along with dozens of volunteers who'd learned to transform their own stories into tools for helping others. But the real funeral was what happened next. The Guardian Project established the Eleanor Vasquez Memorial Fund, providing resources for trafficking survivors to become advocates and counselors. My apartment was converted into a training center where former victims learned to become protectors. And in diners and truck stops and bus stations across the country, people who'd been where Eleanor and I had been continue the work. One conversation at a time, one warning at a time, one life at a time. The stranger's words that stuck with Eleanor for years became the foundation for a movement. The words that stuck with me became the framework for scaling that movement. And somewhere, right now, someone who was saved by that movement is saving someone else. Someone is sitting across from a desperate kid and saying, "Someone's going to offer you something that sounds too good to be true." The work continues. The words continue to echo. And Eleanor's vision of turning individual destruction into collective salvation lives on in every kid who doesn't answer that phone, doesn't take that deal, doesn't end up where we ended up. That's the real power of a stranger's words that stick with you for years. They don't just change your life. They give you the tools to change other lives. One warning at a time, one conversation at a time, one saved life at a time, until the cycle of exploitation becomes a cycle of protection, and the words that once warned of destruction become instructions for building something better.